It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the lunch, Alison Smith. She's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Toronto. She actually completed her PhD in Canadian politics and urban governance here in Montreal at the Université de Montréal. Finished it in 2016. Her teaching and research interests pertain to Canadian politics and public policy, including complex policy making, homelessness governance, and a history of housing policy. She has a book called Multiple Barriers, the Multi-Level Governance of Homelessness in Canada, which was based in part on lots of interviews conducted right here in Montreal. And it was published in July. I think some people here were at her book launch. Unfortunately, I missed it. So it asks why homelessness governance is so different across the country, and argues that the fact that homelessness is not defined in quite the same way in different provinces or jurisdictions explains a lot of these differences. So she has two current research projects, one on homelessness governance in small, mid-sized, and northern communities, and the other that considers rent banks, so that's a bit of a shift in focus for her, something more like a micro-intervention. So rent banks as a measure to prevent homelessness, so very relevant to our topic here today. So she says when she's not teaching or researching, she is usually playing Lego, chess, or baseball with her two young boys. And before I give her the stage, I will mention too that I had the very great pleasure of working pretty closely with Alison during the preparation for the 2015 homelessness count in Montreal. And she was one of kind of many people involved in setting this up. And it really was a joy for me to interact with her. So, Alison.
All right, thank you very much, Eric, for that presentation. Merci beaucoup, Eric, et merci beaucoup à tout le monde qui ont travaillé pour organiser cette conférence. Je suis vraiment contente d'être ici avec vous. I talked to my two little boys this morning. I'll be doing most of my presentation in English today. I talked to my two little boys this morning, and my oldest, who's 6, asked me, "Mommy, are you in Montreal for some quiet time?" And as much as I do love quiet time, I actually would much rather be here with you today. It really is a pleasure. But I have to say that as I was preparing my presentation, I started to feel my imposter syndrome coming up again. This is something I've gotten a bit better at managing in academia. Housing and homelessness are very understudied in my field, and so a lot of times I do have something to say. But this room is a little bit different. I have so much respect for the expertise that exists in this room. That expertise is essential for research and for policy. And so in my presentation to you today, I plan to stay in my lane, which is as a political science researcher. I kind of think of it as a bike lane, not a Toronto bike lane. A Toronto bike lane is oftentimes in the traffic, somebody else's lane, but a Montreal bike lane. And so from this perspective, again, from Canadian political science, there's a few things that I wanted to talk about. So first, talking a little bit about the history of housing in Canada, and if there is something that we might learn from this history, from times when we were not needing to organize so many conversations about housing and homelessness. The Association of Municipalities of Ontario right now, today, has a conversation about housing and homelessness. This is something that is conversations that are so important and that are happening so regularly. That has not always been the case. There's a couple of concepts from Canadian politics and policy studies that I think might help to understand a little bit more in our context that really important question that Pete was asking, which is why don't we do what we do? And I think this Canadian federation that we live in makes it very, very difficult to change social policies and also to really invest in housing policy. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about a province where there is a lot of movement on homelessness prevention. Not enough, but in BC, I think we're seeing a lot of interventions to prevent and reduce homelessness. So again, to remind you of, Pete shared his slides with me before, so about his sort of typology, 5 parts. I'm gonna stick with 5. I think 5 was helpful, and I've also built it into my presentation, so we'll talk about if we need to get it down to 3 later. But when I'm talking about an inclusive housing system, that's something that I think really kind of fits in this universal prevention dimension. And this universal dimension part of housing and homelessness prevention, I think is really important right now, because the targeted measures and the groups who historically have been at risk of experiencing homelessness or becoming unhoused, that's changing. There are more and more people who are at risk. And so that's where these universal measures come into place really importantly at preventing people who may suddenly find themselves for the first time in their life at risk of experiencing homelessness. So when we look back, I won't give you too much of this history. I'm sure that many of you have been involved in this history, but the history of housing policy in Canada, sort of one of the sort of most successful moments of housing policy in Canada was in the 1970s. This was sort of that nonprofit era. The 1960s, the early involvement in housing policy was like big public housing developments, Regent Park in Toronto, that resulted in a lot of concentration of housing need and of social need. We quickly moved away from that into the 70s with sort of smaller developments managed by nonprofits and by co-ops. And both levels of government, provincial and federal, were involved in investing in the housing system and in supporting nonprofit organizations or co-ops, like many of you have done work with this. So this was sort of a time when not all of the housing needs were met. Not everybody had a sort of adequate home in a place where they wanted to live during this time, but about 50% of low-income housing needs were met just through social housing. Now in Toronto, it's decades to get into social housing. That wait list is so long. So working together, 20 to 25,000 units of social housing were being built, or nonprofit housing were being built per year by federal and provincial governments. So I do want to say that I don't think this was a golden era of the welfare state. The benefits of social citizenship, the welfare state was a very gendered welfare state. It was a racialized welfare state. Residential schools were open, mental health institutions were widely open, same-sex protections were not in place. So I don't think there's any problem that we're facing today that the solution is to just let's do what we did in the 70s. We've made a lot of changes since then. I think that's good. But at the same time, I think there are a few things that we can learn. And so in this era, like I said, there were federal and provincial involvement and even leadership. Ontario, so I'm thinking about Abe's comments about our current government in Ontario. Ontario in the 1960s was the absolute leader of the provinces. The first provincial housing corporation was in Ontario. Other provinces followed suit. The Ontario Housing Corporation really rivaled the CMHC federally in terms of expertise and capacity. And other provinces, as I said, kind of followed suit. So in my Canadian politics classes, we taught, and in sort of writing on the history of federalism, we talk about this era as an era of competitive federalism. Internationally, if we look at welfare states around the world, federal welfare states tend to be less generous, less universal, and federalism is a key part of that. It is harder to get more levels of government to agree on generosity or on universality. So oftentimes the welfare state doesn't expand as much in federal countries. All the Scandinavian countries are unitary, and there's something there to that institutional setup. But Canadian history, especially during this period in the 60s and 70s, was kind of a contrast to that theory that federalism limits welfare state expansion. And that's because of this competitive dynamic between federal and provincial governments. Of course, in Quebec, there were tremendous transformations underway in the 60s and 70s. Social policy was really a part of that. Social policy has oftentimes been a tool of nation building. And the area of housing really benefited from senior levels of government, federal and provincial, working together and also sometimes even, competing with one another. Of course, that didn't last. That era of expansion of the welfare state, investment in housing policy did not last. If you don't recognize the era based on the political leaders, I'm sure you'll recognize from the hair that this was the 1990s. This was, James talked about it this morning, this very consequential budget where the federal government made cuts to investments in housing policy, but also very crucially made cuts to transfers, social policy transfers to the provinces. There's a number of transfers that the federal government sends to the provinces, and in the 1990s, the federal government reduced what provinces got. And so, again, speaking to Ontario, there was this appalling transformation. Ontario was the leader in terms of housing, investing in an inclusive system. Ontario was the only province, which sort of explains why Quebec municipalities don't have homelessness plans yet, although they're sometimes in development, but Ontario ones do. Ontario transferred that responsibility to local governments, to municipalities. Crucially, did not also transfer financial resources or authority to invest in housing. So we have, Ontario has gone from the leader in the housing system to totally benching itself, taking itself completely out of the game. And that is very much a problem right now, but even since the late 1990s, the province of Ontario has not been involved, in the housing system in a very meaningful way. So what this moment, I think, really made clear is the imbalance that exists in the Canadian Federation. And so again, when Pete's identifying these 4 reasons why we don't do what we need to do, we have an added layer of complexity in the Canadian Federation, which is the distribution of powers and resources. In 1867, brief sort of history, Canadian politics history lesson here, many of you will know sections 91 and 92 of the Canadian Constitution outline provincial and federal responsibilities. Those were set pretty much in 1867. There have been a few amendments, but for the most part, it remains what it was. John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister, wanted a centralized federation, so he gave the federal government the most important powers, which were military, criminal defense, postal service, which maybe was a big deal back then, trade, really big, expensive areas of policy that were hugely consequential at that time. Provinces got like the little ones, the inexpensive ones, the unimportant ones, healthcare, education, social assistance, property and civil rights. And this fiscal structure of the Federation was set up with that balance in mind. The federal government needs more money to exercise those powers than the provinces did. Of course, over time that has changed. Healthcare, education, housing, social assistance have grown, but the fiscal setup has not changed. So provinces depend on the federal government for transfers. The federal government has more resources than it needs in order to exercise its powers. So there are a series of unconditional transfers, which is equalization, and conditional transfers, such as the Canada Health Transfer. Those transfers are at the unilateral discretion of the federal government. The federal government decides what provinces get. And we saw this with the health transfer negotiations recently. Provinces tried to put pressure on the federal government to say we need more money. It's not a negotiation. It's not a partnership. The federal government decides, and provinces have no choice but to accept what is offered. So it reflects like a very serious power imbalance that maybe wasn't noticed as much when the federal government was investing in competition, but still investing, than in the 1990s when the federal government backed away and also cut transfer payments to the provinces. So we had a system in the 60s and 70s of some competition between levels of government. They worked, apart, but also together, pulling in the same direction, creating a housing system, to one where there is this terrible mismatch of authority and resources and expertise and financial structures where everyone is sort of blaming everyone else. And it's really annoying when that happens, but it also is kind of true that everybody does need to be at the table, and the federal government in particular. In Ontario, it's particularly complex. I was at a housing conference in Winnipeg 2 weeks ago, and I heard that the prairie provinces are looking at devolving housing policy, and it's like, we have 20 years of evidence that that doesn't work in Ontario. Like it's unless the resources follow. But so Ontario municipalities do not have the capacity to renovate the old housing, let alone new housing. But so that's the setup that we have. One final dimension here is drift, and I know there's a working group on immigration, and immigration is part of it. So in the 60s and 70s, we had housing policy, not totally, but kind of meeting housing need, pretty close in terms of what governments were doing, what the markets were doing. Over time, government decisions moved further away from what the social need was. But that's not all. Governments also failed to respond to changes socially, demographically, economically, that were presenting themselves in increasing need in the housing system. So drift doesn't result just from policy decisions, but also indecisions. So not only has policy pulled away from need, but the need itself has changed. And it's created this enormous gap in terms of the social safety net. And bringing policy back in line with social need is not just a matter of bringing policy to where it was, but actually really transforming policy to meet this new reality. And with homelessness, we see homelessness is kind of the result of multiple gaps, multiple crises. And if we think about them in terms of waves, the only thing that I remember from high school physics, is how waves interact when they crash. They don't pass through one another, they superimpose. And so within the housing system, there's a housing crisis, but it's superimposing with other crises. James talked this morning about this horrifying increase in overdose and the use of naloxone at OBM, a toxic drug supply, the health crisis, just this absolute tsunami wave of unmet need. And getting policy to come together and to meet it is a huge challenge. So what, if anything, is happening about it? So this is David Eby. He's the current premier of BC. He's an NDP premier. He has a background in advocating for civil rights, kind of, as we might say, a shit disturber. He has been, leading campaigns to protest the Olympics, to make sure that to sort of make sure that communities aren't being over-policed. I grew up in BC. The NDP in BC has historically been very much in line with the federal Liberals. That started to change with John Horgan. It became a bit more ideological. With Eby, it is squarely an ideological left-of-center NDP government. And he's making interventions throughout in various ways. So in 2018, John Horgan introduced a housing policy. It's been updated in 2022. And they've also introduced a homelessness plan very recently to prevent and to reduce homelessness in BC. So again, if I show you this typology from Pete here, there's interventions in all of these different dimensions of prevention. One of them being the Rental Protection Fund. This is $500 million that the province is making available to co-ops or nonprofits who can purchase housing and protect it as affordable housing. So this is, Eric was talking about sort of a sweet spot in terms of universal prevention. I think that's sort of what this is in terms of preventing that housing from becoming unaffordable, and so making that available. It will be managed by a Rental Protection Fund Society, which is made up of 3 groups: the BC Nonprofit Housing Association, the Co-op Housing Federation of BC, and the Aboriginal Housing Management Association. They had to demand that control of the money. The money was made available, and then they had to go and say that we want to control it, but so that is now available. They've also increased the shelter allowance, so social assistance in BC is divided into an income component and a shelter component. Je n'ai pas traduit les diapos, je pense qu'un one bedroom, je pense que c'est un 2,5. I think that's right. So in 2007, the shelter component of social assistance was $375. It's now been increased in one go to $500. This is still dramatically underfunded in terms of what people need, so it's maybe not appropriate to call it actually prevention, but it has been unchanged since 2007 and then this big jump. There's also been, since 2019, a provincially funded rent bank program. So beginning in 2019, there's been $10 million made available for local groups across the province to manage. There has been a $7.5 million boost to that funding. There was a survey done of people who benefited from the rent bank, either a loan or a grant, between April and June 2021. So this is a small number of people, but 91% of those respondents who received emergency rent bank assistance to prevent an eviction that would have resulted from either arrears or an inability to pay rent 1 month. 91% of people who received that assistance said that the rent bank contributed to their housing stability. And incredibly, 61% of respondents said that they would have faced homelessness had they not received that rent bank intervention. So there's other things that are happening as well. There's a complex care model of housing for people for whom supportive housing doesn't meet their needs. The province is making it clear that they will override local zoning decisions to prevent exclusionary zoning, to make way for more middle income, sort of missing middle housing, and yet it is still not enough. I mean, it's a lot, but it's not enough. It's not enough to make a dent into the deep and wide housing crisis in BC. So in conclusion, I want to just sort of talk back again to the federal government. Again, thinking about the distribution of resources, the federal government has the resources and they need to be the ones to make it available and get that into the hands of people who know what to do with it. One of the most helpful things the federal government can do when it comes to preventing homelessness and creating an inclusive housing system is to move money around, get money into the hands of people who can use it for good. So one thing the federal government could do would be to create a federal acquisition fund to allow community groups to purchase buildings that are for sale. I know Montreal has a little money for this, $50 million. That's not a lot. The real money to do that kind of, it's important, but it's not enough. The money for that is at the federal level. So that's one thing, and also rolling out the money for the urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. There has been money promised in the federal budget. It's not set to roll out until 2024. NICHI, which was established in 2022, the National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Inc., is ready for that money now, and they are committed to a for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing strategy. There's no reason for them to be waiting until 2024. So getting the money to the knowers, to the people who know what to do, I think is something the federal government can do, and it can help bolster the efforts of activist governments like in BC, but also in places like Ontario and maybe also here where the province isn't doing as much and can sort of help you all in your work in terms of waiting until you get the province back on board. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Merci. Hannah just told me that there's a time for questions. I didn't know that.
Hey, awesome talk. Thanks a lot. Just a really quick one about the kind of federal-provincial split here. I think, like, roughly speaking, like in fiscal terms, I think the role of the federal and provincial governments more or less reversed, right? Like back when the federal government was in the housing game, they were in a bunch of games and were raising a ton of tax revenue, spending a ton of revenue, and that just isn't true in general anymore, right? Provincial governments do the lion's share of taxing and spending. So I'm wondering kind of where basically what it would look like for the federal government to be prioritizing, the housing issues in not so much in the context of yes, they used to do it, but more in the context of actually, like, broadly speaking, and again as a consequence of Martin, they've just stepped back from all this stuff, not just housing. So I don't know, like, what the kind of political economy that looks like.
Yeah, I'm not a political economist, but I do think that when we look at who's taxing, the federal government does have more taxes than provinces have, and so provinces depend on those federal transfers for social policy or for health policy. It used to be an open tap before the 90s. It used to just be, they called them like 50-cent dollars, that social programs were financed at the provincial level, and 50 cents of every dollar that was spent was covered by the federal government. And so that change in the 90s was the federal government said, no, we're putting a cap on that. in English, we call it the cap on cap. It was the Canada Assistance Plan, and so they put a cap on cap, saying provinces, you can't keep social spending. And the thing the federal government did was they said, well, you provinces are always complaining about conditions, because there were conditions attached to cap. And so they said, we're not going to have the conditions anymore, but we're going to give you less money and you get to do whatever it is that you want with it. So the Canada Social Transfer and the Canada Health Transfer are sort of transfers that reflect the imbalance that continues to exist. When it comes to what role the federal government has, I mean, there's a role for the province, and I think Quebec always has a Canada-Quebec agreement, so in the event there was an acquisition strategy, I think your old hat at developing those Canada-Quebec agreements, so I don't know if that would need to be in place for nonprofits, but that's kind of one of the things that I do see the federal government being able to do, is to just move the money around and get it really sort of to the people who are able to manage and to protect the housing, possibly through the provinces or beyond the provinces.